rabbi?
What led me to become a rabbi? Well, I grew up in a home that was, in terms of the context of our community, in Wharton, Texas, a little town in southeast Texas. We went to synagogue every Friday night. We had Kiddush and Motzi and Shabbos dinner and went to shul. And in the context of that community, we were an observant family. I didn't know much beyond that, but I had a wonderful rabbi who'd come from Europe. He escaped the Holocaust. And I studied with him privately, and he was in our home a lot. We were in his home a lot. And I was very attracted, and I wanted to continue Jewish studies when I left home after high school. I'd been to Camp Ramah in California before my 2 last years in high school. And that intensified my desire to study more. So instead of going to the University of Texas, where I was all set, I applied to Yeshiva University and went there and studied for 4 years and got a very good Jewish education. And during that time, I decided I wanted to continue this as my life work and try to share my enjoyment with Jewish study to other people. So I went to JTS, which felt like a more comfortable home.
What do you feel is the role of the rabbi in Judaism?
Yeah, I think the rabbi's primary responsibility is teaching, whether it's on the pulpit, whether it's in classroom, whether it's in personal conversations. I think that's a main role of the rabbi. I also think a rabbi is there as a representative of the tradition to people. And I see that in context of doing pastoral work especially, whether it's in the office, whether it's in the hospital, whether it's with a grieving family or around a death. The rabbi is able to bring the richness of the tradition to people and help them live Jewish lives and incorporate the wealth of beauty, values in our tradition personally.
Is there an enhanced spirituality to being a rabbi?
Yes, there is absolutely a dimension of spirituality. I mean, that's what attracted me. I mean, the study, yes, but the spiritual dimension behind it all, in relating to something greater than just the immediate tangible world around, it's always been very exciting. And I find that often through music, certainly as a kid, singing in synagogue and chanting prayers and things like this that I learned from my rabbi. That was a strong, powerful attraction.
How might you compare being a rabbi to, for example, being a priest in the Catholic tradition or perhaps a minister in the Protestant tradition? Are they more or less the same? Are there differences?
Well, I've never been a priest or a minister, but my perception is that there is a difference. And sometimes it's something that I've felt that I struggle against, trying to fulfill the priestly role. Sometimes people want to put you in the priestly role, but I would rather be in the pastoral and teaching role rather than the priestly role.
All right. There are, of course, different Jewish denominations. Which one do you identify with, and what do you think makes it unique?
I'm a conservative rabbi. I grew up in a conservative synagogue, and though I went to an Orthodox college and appreciated the richness of learning and the depth of observance in the Orthodox world, and I still do, I find myself more comfortable in the conservative world, which I think has a broader worldview and a broader view of people and a more, shall we say, historically grounded appreciation for Jewish tradition. I have the feeling, in many cases in the Orthodox world, that there is almost a blind acceptance to Torah being given by God to Moses at Sinai, in toto, without the nuancing that I believe we in the conservative movement do, where we acknowledge that there's been growth in tradition, most likely multiple authors of Torah, certainly multiple strands of belief and observance fused into Mishnah and Talmud. And I appreciate that kind of study. The sort of digging behind the surface excites me, and I want to expose people to that. And blocking it off. For example, when I was in yeshiva, it was considered unacceptable to talk about biblical criticism at all. It was simply a subject not on the agenda. And even, in fact, when our daughter went to Maimonides, when we were interviewing the school to see if this was an appropriate place for her, I spoke with the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the school, about this subject and wanted to know if biblical criticism is at all on the agenda in their institution. And it was, to my pleasurable surprise, and did find it among some of the Bible teachers that they were aware of it and did teach it in class. And that was good. That was very positive.
How do you put those two things together when somebody comes to you and says, I'm sure they have, biblical criticism teaches us that the Bible is written by human beings,
right.
But the tradition, how do we accept the tradition is important given that?
It's a good question. Personally, I can accept human beings writing Torah, being the authors of this tradition. But I look to what's in the text. I look to what the values are, what the lessons are that flow from this. And I find the values, the fundamental lessons for living in Torah so exciting and so compelling that who wrote it doesn't matter. And the fact that human beings subscribe to it and coalesce as communities around these values is very powerful for me.
What do you do with texts that we might call difficult texts that reflect values that we may not share? Portions of the Torah and the like.
Admit that they're difficult, and admit that we've grown from there. And often I teach, those texts and what they became in later times, or how they've changed. One of my favorite texts to show is the text in Parshat Ki Tisa, the 13 attributes of God, where if you read the full text, as you know, the end of the passage after God is described as loving and forgiving and forbearing and whatever, it then says, but as to carrying away sin, doesn't wipe the slate away clean. Whereas the rabbis took that same text and chopped off the last two words and transformed the text completely. Well, I think that's very exciting because it shows, A, the power of the rabbis and the essential rabbinic tradition in its play and how it has helped to shape what we know as Judaism. Because we're not biblical Jews, we're rabbinic Jews. And what the rabbis did then, we continue to do even today in adapting halakha, Jewish practice, reinterpreting text, and sometimes saying, this text just doesn't work for us anymore, or there's a countervailing text in the tradition that we have to look at as a counterweight and give more emphasis to it.
So, can you talk a bit about the importance that you ascribe to the rabbis? I mean, can you do Judaism without the rabbis and their writings?
I don't think so. I don't believe so. If you read the Torah, you can't function. There's not enough information there. And you would also be practicing something probably pretty primitive. I think you can't do it. And I think people who have claimed to try, like Karaites, quickly saw that they had to develop their own Karaite tradition, which was their interpretation and spin on the text. They couldn't simply follow the letter of the Torah because there's not enough information there. It demands interpretation. And that's part of the beauty of the whole system, is that each thing that you say demands more interpretation, whichever field of Judaism you're in, whichever movement, and each one has its own particular nuancing. But the openness and the viability of that and the excitement that provides is what really keeps this tradition alive and ongoing.
There are many different Jewish groups that have considered themselves practitioners of Judaism. Do you think that there are limits? Would you, for example, consider Messianic Judaism as an authentic branch of Judaism?
Messianic Judaism, I think, is beyond the limits. I do think that there are many varieties of Judaism which I may not observe or may not be attracted to, but I recognize that they are legitimate, workable definitions and interpretations for people. And I think that from within the conservative movement perspective, we look at a kind of big tent within our own community and can see communities to, shall we say, the left and right of us as also being part of the entire Jewish people. But I do think that Messianic Judaism is beyond, because the notion of Jesus as being an aspect of God or an embodiment of God is just beyond where Judaism, I believe, is prepared to go.
Are there other kinds of red lines that you would say to differentiate authentic versus inauthentic? Or
Well, I have a problem with ultra right-wing Orthodox Jews on the right claiming to speak in the name of authentic tradition, when I think that they really don't. I think that they perhaps speak to an era that is long gone, whether it's in the ghetto or whether it's in biblical times where there was this need to defend and fight against all comers who might not have been from our community. And I think that there are problems with that. So I am not one necessarily to endorse those as legitimate voices of Judaism, though they're usually considered as such.
what role do the mitzvot play in Judaism, and is there a kind of particularly conservative way of approaching the mitzvot?
I don't know about the conservative way of approaching the mitzvot, but for me, the mitzvot are embodiment of our values. They give you a structure to life. They help us connect to God. Whenever you say a bracha over performing a mitzvah, you're connecting to God. You sort of have to recognize that God has a role in your life. Whether it's food that you eat or actions that you observe, there is a connection to the depth of Jewish spirituality and to the one we believe creates the world, however you interpret that and whatever you mean by that. I think it also is important to see in mitzvot a kind of community building structure, because when communities collectively observe mitzvot, there is a commonality that sort of binds them and helps them recognize that they are part of the same group. And I think that that's helpful.
Is there a particularly conservative approach to halakha and the determination of halakha?
Yeah, in terms of halakha, I think that we, as I spoke about in reference to Bible, same thing is true with halakha. We recognize that there is growth of the tradition of the halakha. We can see that in ancient times there were different foci among the rabbis. We can see that there were different patterns that emerged. And we also can recognize that there were disagreements among the rabbis. I mean, you look at any Mishnah text and you see 2, 3, sometimes 5 different opinions. Well, there was a certain legitimacy to them and integrity to the positions. And that speaks, I think, to the availability of multiple opinions at work, the same community, at the same time, in today's world. So that a lot of people get very uncomfortable in our movement with the fact that the conservative movement's law committee can produce a response on the tshuva with 13 voting in favor and 13 voting against, and it becomes an optional practice for people. People don't understand that this is perfectly normal. I mean, this is healthy difference of opinion, and 2 viable practices can emerge within the community, and sometimes more. I think that's thrilling, and you don't have to be forced into one position and that minority opinions get shut out. I think that it gives more diversity, more play, more integrity to variety, and I think that's very healthy.
The question of Jewish identity has been a source of some contention for decades and maybe longer. Who, in your opinion, is a Jew? Are there different dimensions to Jewishness? For example, might you consider a person Jewish in one context but not in another?
I'm not sure that I would consider somebody Jewish in one context and not in another. I'm not quite sure how to respond to that other than that I just wouldn't. And I do follow the traditional norm of a Jew as a person born to a Jewish mother or who converts to Judaism. Now, we have a conversion program in our community, which I organize, and we teach people to observe mitzvot. We teach them about Bible and Jewish heritage and history and rabbinic tradition and so forth like this, Shabbat observance, Kashrut observance, and so forth, holidays. But we don't insist that people perform everything in the strictest way possible. But we want to get people on the road towards observing and learning more and incorporating more Jewish practice into their lives. Now, there are people who would say that our converts are not converts. they're not really Jews because they don't do everything that an Orthodox Jew would do, and they're not converts, they're not really Jews because I'm not an Orthodox rabbi, and the other people on our Beit Din are also not. So I would dissent in that respect, all right? I think that these people who make a sincere commitment are viable, legitimate, authentic Jews, and many of them live very actively as Jews in our community. So I'm quite proud of that. So my definition is the same as those in the more traditional world, but how we go about it and what we require is different.
How long does the process take to convert?
For us, we have a course that goes the better part of a year. Some people are prepared at the end of that course to convert and make an obligation upon themselves to live as a Jew. Other people want to take more time and do. Some people play with it for a few years even before they enter the course. We had a man in the congregation, who was coming to our services every Shabbat faithfully for maybe 8 or 9 years before he finally came to me and said, okay, I'm ready to sign up for the class. But he was moving in that direction, getting comfortable, and then he still comes every Shabbat, and very faithful attender, and very happy to be here.
There's a movement toward ethical and eco-kashrut.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about that a little bit? What is it? What do you do? And do you think that kashrut does have anything to do with ethics and the environment?
Well, let me answer the first part first. The answer is yes. I think ethics is at the bedrock of kashrut. People may not agree with me, but I see in the sensitivity of not mixing milk and meat based on the Torah's prescription of not seething a kid in its mother's milk as an ethical issue from the ground up. I mean, it speaks to a sensitivity for animal life, and by implication, I think it's supposed to teach us about respect for human life. And so I see ethics as the bedrock of at least that part of kashrut, and it flows to the whole system. I think what kashrut also is trying to teach us is an appreciation for food and for having a spiritual connection to the food that we eat. So that we're not just sitting down to our tables and going through a biological necessity to fill our guts and sustain our physical lives, but when we say brachot, when we eat certain things and not other things, then we have to look to the source of who commanded us this. So we'll call it God's commandments, even if we are not biblical literalists. But recognize that there's a spiritual dimension there, and see ourselves in a sense as tenants in the world. We're not the ultimate dominant masters of the world. We share the world with other people, we share the world with animals, and so we are a bit restrained in how we fill our biological needs and appreciate the ethical dimensions underlying it all. So to add an ethical component to kashrut certification, which is part of this movement that you refer to, I think it's essential. I think it's really bringing to the fore one of the components that's there to begin with, and I welcome it. And certainly when we've seen in recent years really abominable behavior on the part of quote-unquote kosher meat packers, the treatment of workers, the treatment of animals, even though it may have followed the letter of the law in certain ways of how the animals were slaughtered, the whole treatment of the animals and the treatment of the people who did the work was terrible, and I think is a debasement of the system. That's not what it's about.
But might you go so far as to argue that meat produced under such conditions is actually not kosher?
I haven't said that, but I have avoided buying from those producers. Personally, yeah.
Okay. What role does study play in Judaism?
I think study is a central issue because it's through study that we connect to God, to other Jews, to this very rich tradition. And I think without studying, you don't really know what being Jewish is all about. I think that's one of the failings of the American Jewish community, is that we don't put enough study in the center of our Jewishness. I don't know what else to say about it. It's the bedrock. It's what for me has been the stimulus for my whole life engagement in Judaism. it gives me pleasure. It's exciting to discover, to try to work through ideas, to see how ideas get played through the tradition, how ideas from the outside are brought into the tradition, and how our tradition influences other traditions. And you can only do that with serious, careful study. And you look discriminatingly at words in Bible, in rabbinic tradition, and engage in conversation with people about it. It's binding in terms of relationships and binding in terms of us to a long heritage. And I think that the study in Judaism is the key to all of it.
As you know, there's a classic rabbinic debate about whether one should study for its own sake or study for the sake of doing good deeds and see it leads to something. Do you have a personal opinion on that debate?
I think it's both, personally. I think it's fun and exciting to just study for the sake of itself. I mean, we had a Board of Rabbis meeting last week, as you know, where we brought in a colleague to talk with us about material in a book that he had translated from Professor Heschel. And it gave us a day of really delight. I mean, we may or not use that anyway, although I probably will use it in sermons and classes and things like this. But the point was not to do it for a functional purpose. The purpose was to learn and to enjoy, and I think all of us who were there had that experience. That being said, studying Torah, in whichever aspect of it you do, should, I hope, ideally, lead to practice. I had a lot of satisfaction a few years ago. I've been teaching a Talmud class here for, 20 years maybe. And there's a math professor at URI who's been part of the class most of those years. We had studied about Lost and Found in Bava Metzia many years ago. And he told me, I just happened to bump into him at the filling station. And he said, "Do you remember what we talked about Lost and Found?" He said, "Well, I found whatever it was. I don't remember what he found, but he found something, and he made an announcement about it because he remembered about announcing and making it public. Nobody ever came forward, but it stayed with him, and he followed through on doing the mitzvah that he learned from study." That was thrilling. I got to tell you, it really gave me a big charge. And he was very proud to tell me.
What role do you assign to Hebrew?
Hebrew is critical. I think every Jew needs to know Hebrew to know what this tradition is. There's an image that if you try to read Jewish texts without knowing Hebrew, it's like kissing the bride through a veil. You're not really touching the bride. And I think with all the translations that we can possibly do, it's very nice. And we in America are blessed with wonderful, thoughtful, carefully done translations of all of our texts. I mean, really all of our texts are so much available. But it's not like knowing Hebrew and being able to read the text in the original, because the originals are full of poetic nuances. And unless you can catch that, you're missing half of the lesson. And so when I teach, I try to unpack that for people, the nuancing of what the Hebrew language is. But when people have already studied it, you can have a different level conversation and a better appreciation of what the system is all about, because it's all interlinked, and the language is the key.
How about something like prayer? Does God hear Hebrew better than English?
That I'm not sure about. I think God hears deep emotion, whatever language it's expressed in. I mean, I think that it's binding as a community to recite our prayers together in Hebrew. But I think that if it's a choice between saying something that you really have on your mind and heart, and you want to express, and you can say it better in English, better to say it in English.
What about the modern state of Israel? What role does that play for Jews today? Israel, I think, is a convening center for many Jews, although some people don't recognize it yet, don't appreciate that dimension. And unfortunately, not enough Jews in America have been there. Many have, but not enough. But I think that what Israel does for us is that it gives a place for Jewish tradition
to play itself out in the modern world in a real constructive way. Whether it's always used that way or not, it's a different story. But I think that it gives us an opportunity to let this tradition, which is so old, flourish in the modern world and continue to develop and struggle with the realities of modernity. There are obviously people in Israel who prefer not to deal with modernity and who would rather live in a shtetl and close themselves off in the ancient world and live only Jews with no outside influences. I don't think that's what the State of Israel was created to be. I don't think that would be using its potential as a focus and center of Jewish life today. And I think for the most part, it's not the walled-off variety that is dominant.
What do you consider to be the ideal Jewish worship experience?
For me, it's one with lots of singing, spirited singing, where people together know the melodies, where there's a kind of commonality of what the focus is going on, and where there is a deep emotion that's able to be evoked because people are comfortable with it. It's hard to achieve, but there are places where it's achievable.
Could you talk about the role of women in Judaism? Does Judaism recognize any differences between men and women?
Well, in our congregation and in many in the conservative movement, there basically are no differences at this point. We have very much equalized women's roles in the synagogue. Traditionally, it wasn't that way, and certainly in the Orthodox world, it's still not that way. But in our movement, it's pretty much that way, although not universally. There are still a number of conservative synagogues where women don't have the same prerogatives for participation, whether leading services, reading Torah, and so forth. But in this congregation, they do. And so those differences have been, in many circles, minimized. In other circles, they're being struggled with. I mean, in the Orthodox world, there are still struggles as to what women can be permitted to do. Some congregations have opened up to have women's minyanim, separate from men's minyanim. Some places won't allow that. For example, at Maimonides, they were not prepared to have a women's minyan, which was disappointing to me, but they weren't willing to do that. Will things change there? They may, likely, but because some of their constituents in Newton, in one of the synagogues there, they do have a separate women's minyan. But these are fermentation times, and different movements move at a different pace in terms of reacting to the realities of the world around. So the Reform movement was there before we were there. We were there long before the Orthodox movement began to wrestle with it. But I think that you'll see more of it. You have probably one or two women at this point who have been ordained as rabbis. Of course, they have given them funny titles, and the rabbis who, quote-unquote, ordained them were rebuked and things like this. But there's serious engagement in the Orthodox world among women who want to study and lead and be responsible interpreters of Torah as well. And it will happen there.
Is there a Jewish understanding of sexuality?
I'm not sure I understand what your question is.
So if somebody were to come to you and ask, what is the kind of what Jewish perspectives, or what does Judaism bring to me as a perspective on sexuality and sexual ethics?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how might you respond to that?
All right. So I would say Judaism regards sexuality as positive, as one of the pleasures in life. It doesn't condemn it, but it tries to put it in the framework of a committed relationship between two people. And I say that specifically two people because, in earlier days we might have said between a man and a woman. Our movement does now acknowledge that there can be committed relationships between two men and two women. And so that we have come to accommodate the homosexual perspective as well. Other branches of Judaism are not as comfortable with that. But we believe that making a commitment with another partner and having a sacred life together within the context of a committed relationship is how sexuality can best be channeled and respected.
Can that committed relationship be a non-marital relationship?
Ideally, it's in marriage. It can be premarital as well. I mean, classically, a sexual relationship was a marital relationship. But I acknowledge that there can be such even without being married. Yeah. There's a paper that Elliot Dorff wrote a number of years ago in which he points out the ideal as being in a marital relationship, but acknowledges that with commitment there can be kind of elevation of the sexual experience even in a non-marital relationship. It sort of builds with it. And frankly, I mean, I'm a rabbi now 41 years. It is the rare couple who comes to me for marriage that has not already had sexual relations. I almost wonder why haven't they? You know, it's very unusual in our world. That may not be true in other communities, but in the places where I've lived and the people that I've worked with, that's been pretty much the reality.
Can you elaborate a little more on the recent discussions and developments in how conservative Judaism approaches homosexuality?
Yeah, I think that we've come to recognize that what's essential is the commitment that people make to each other. We recognize that there is a certain biological reality to homosexual inclination. And it's not an illness as people used to think, and it's not a perversion as people used to think, as some people still think. But we've come to recognize, learning from contemporary scientific information, that there are inbred biological bases for this. And rather than reject it and say, you have to deny people the pleasure of a partnership, we're prepared to deal realistically with how people are and what their needs are, and feel that the tradition can elevate the relationships rather than having them be non-relationships or non-sanctioned relationships.
Where's the Jewish perspective on abortion?
Well, already from the Mishnah, you find permission for abortion if the fetus is a threat to the mother's life. And to the degree that the Mishnah is very graphic in saying that if the fetus is likely to kill the mother, the fetus, who is not a born person and therefore doesn't have human status yet, could be cut up limb by limb even within the mother's womb, so that it doesn't jeopardize her life. That's pretty extreme, but it does say that though a fetus is an incipient human life, it is not yet a human life fully with all the rights of being a human being. And so I have endorsed the notion that if the fetus is in some way a threat to the mother's life, and one of our scholars wrote a book many years ago pointing out that even psychological harm to the mother could be a warrant for abortion, and I have guided people along those lines over the years. But I would say it should not be the first line of approach towards how to deal with pregnancy or avoiding pregnancy.
What about a Jewish perspective on birth control?
I think that birth control is legitimate practice. I think that, again, our tradition has various mechanisms which traditionally were employed and others that weren't approved. But bottom line, I think that it is legitimate.
You elaborate more on those methods that are
I really haven't studied them in years, and would rather not comment.
What about masturbation?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it as I presume. Well, I don't know. I think that there are people who, at times, need to pleasure themselves and do, and it's not the worst thing in the world.
When is it permissible for Jews to kill others?
In self-defense, but not as a first point of departure. Our tradition has looked for all kinds of ways to avoid killing. In judicial circumstances, I think in intergroup conflict as well. And I think when necessary to defend one person's life or a community's life, and I think it's appropriate and necessary, and Judaism teaches us that. But going on the attack is problematic. I think it's very, very challenging, very difficult.
Would you say there's a Jewish approach to capital punishment?
Yeah, I mean, again, in my Talmud class, we studied chapter in Tractate Sanhedrin several years ago. And it's clear that the rabbis in the Talmud looked for every way possible to prevent capital punishment. Every out possible. It was always tilting in judicial deliberations and examination of witnesses and everything, tilting towards exoneration as opposed to conviction. And that's always been something that's guided me in my attitude towards capital punishment in America. I think our tradition doesn't like it, even though they didn't erase the text from the Torah which says that you do this in certain circumstances. I think that the way it's been hedged in has certainly been designed to make it virtually impossible to do. And I respect that. I appreciate that. I think, unfortunately, a lot of Americans don't understand that. I mean, you have this case right now that's been all in the news and so sensationalized, this trial in Florida with Casey Anthony. I mean, people are actually hysterical over the fact that the jury didn't convict her. And people are saying that she's got to be protected, and there are likely to be people out wanting to kill her on the streets. I mean, it's like, are we out of our minds? I mean, I thought that what the jury did, I didn't follow the thing carefully, but my sense was that the jury was very careful in listening to the attorney's presentations, and that there wasn't material to convict her. They could not prove it. And you know well that our tradition says you can't commit capital punishment, you can't impose capital punishment if somebody didn't see the act happen and in fact warn the perpetrator before doing the act that A, they shouldn't do it, and B, that the punishment would be capital punishment. Well, that certainly wasn't here now. Now, this jury wasn't acting under Jewish law, but they certainly were careful enough to scrutinize the evidence and see that it wasn't convincing. Did she do it? I don't know if she did it or not. Is she a nice person? Probably not. But that doesn't matter. That's not the issue. The question is whether she's liable to the death penalty or not, and clearly she's not. And so, I mean, I think that this is kind of what our tradition teaches as well.
Some Jews have made Baruch Goldstein into a hero. How do you respond to that?
I think that's reprehensible. There's just been a rabbi who was influential in Baruch Goldstein's life and who considers him a hero, a righteous man, who has been himself hauled into court for authorizing and giving his blessings to a book that gives license to kill Palestinians, and probably other Jews who would be helpers of theirs as well. I was just hauled into court in Jerusalem last week or the week before, Dov Lior, and the Israeli government seems to be almost powerless against him, and I'm very troubled by it, frankly. I think that respect for people who aren't like us is essential. I think that that's one of the fundamental lessons in Judaism, that God created everybody, whether they're black or white, or brown, or yellow, or if they believe in Judaism or Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or nothing, we all are human beings. We all have equal rights to life. And what I believe Judaism tries to teach us is respect for all life, for all human beings, and to recognize that God created everybody and created us all different. And our challenge is to be respectful of everybody, precisely because we are all related. We are all brothers and sisters. We are all God's children. And that's one of the fundamental lessons that flows to me from the opening of Genesis and the story of creation. I don't know if there was an Adam and an Eve or not, probably not. But the idea that there was one founding couple from whom all human beings flowed is a lesson which says that we're all related. We are all fundamentally equal. And nobody has more rights or less rights to life than we do. And I think that these people who would support Baruch Goldstein and do what he did are way off base. And they are not righteous Jews, and they are not religious Jews, because they've completely distorted and misconstrued what our tradition is all about.
Now, some have claimed also that the murder of Yitzhak Rabin was based on, was a justifiable murder according to Jewish law and the principles of Moser and Rodef.
Yeah, for the same reasons that I just said. I think that that's terribly misguided and a distortion of Judaism. It's not what this tradition is all about. People who look to find ways to bring people together in peace, I think, are the ones who speak responsibly of what Judaism is about, rather than those who see ways to divide Jews and non-Jews, and Jews from Jews who are in different camps as well. And so I think that those who taught the murderer of Yitzhak Rabin were themselves misguided, and I wish that there were a louder hue and cry within the Jewish community in Israel and here against those kinds of teachings, because I think that they're reprehensible, I think they're not Jewish, and I think that they do great damage.
Now, we live in a society today in which we have a kind of a strict separation between church and state. And some have argued that religion has no role to play in the public square and in political discourse. Do you agree with that? Would you modify that? Do you approach that?
I think it's fine, and I think it's appropriate, actually, for us to bring our varying religious positions to bear on life in the community, bringing our values, bringing our insights, and being part of the play. But when a religious tradition tries to dominate and prevent or force actions in legislatures or governmental leaders and things like this because of their positions, I think that begins to be unhealthy. And I think that's what Roger Williams, who founded this colony so many years ago, 375 to be exact, I think that's what he was trying to prevent, and I admire that. I think that's very noble. I think it's one of the great gifts of Western civilization to the world, which most of the world still doesn't understand. But I think that that's an ingenious concept.